Okay. Good morning, everyone. Masechta Bava Kama. We're on Daf Nun Beis Amud Aleph. We just started the Mishnah. I'd just like to, as I like to do, point out one thing from the previous thing that we've been learning, maybe a slight correction that could be made, or a clarification rather. We saw a machloikis again, just to chaz over it one more time, a machloikis between Rebbe and Rabbanon about if a person digs a bore of 9 and then the second person extends it to 10, so and the shore falls in and gets damaged with nezikin, so Rebbe said achar shneihen lenezikin, they're both chayav, they split the nezikin, and according to the Rabbanon you always go after the second person who extended it to 10, and therefore only the second person pays. So I think I said maybe quickly that according to Rebbe they'll split the payment half-half. Whereas it seems to me that half-half, if you're American, yes. But it seems chatzi. But it seems to be that that might not be true. It could be that actually they split it according to however much each one dug. So if the first person dug 9 tefachim, then he will be paying 90%, and the person who dug the 10 tefach will be paying 10%. Why do I say this? Because there's a sif in the Shulchan Aruch that says as follows: if a person dug a bore of 8 and then extended it to 9, so in that case, the Shulchan Aruch writes that each person pays according to what he did, and they split it up. So why am I deducing from there? Because actually, la halacha we passing like the Rabbanon. So in the psak halachas we go with the Rabbanon. The Rabbanon really say that if it goes from 9 to 10, then you'll always go after the second person. So when it comes to nezikin or misa, when it's from 9 to 10, the second person will always be the one who's chayav to pay. So la halacha, we don't have a case of splitting in that case. But the Rabbanon do agree, it seems from the Shulchan Aruch, that if a person goes from 8 to 9, or from 5 to 7, or whatever it will be, as long as the second person is not hitting it up to 10, then they do divide. And when they're dividing, each one pays according to their what they did. So that's probably going to be then reflect on Rebbe as well, that Rebbe says you always divide Nezikin, even if the second person gets to 10. So it would seem to be that actually each one will pay according to the amount that they had dug. Just wanted to clarify that point, which was a chiddush for me also. So that was good to clear that up. Okay, so we saw the Mishnah on Daf Nun Beis Amud Aleph said. We'll just see a couple of parts of the Mishnah because that's going to be very much Nageya for the Gemara today. The Mishnah started off Kiso Harishon. Everyone's got the Mishnah on Daf Nun Beis Amud Aleph. The Mishnah. Kiso Harishon Ubo Hasheni Umotzoi Magule. Veloy Kiso Hasheni Chayev. So we're dealing again with a bore that belongs to 2 people. It was dug completely by 2 people, not one after the other. It's a bore which was belonging in or dug by 2 people. They're both really could be responsible for it. So the first one of the owners, one of the shuktin came and used it and then covered it properly when he left the scene. He covered it properly, and then the second person came and uncovered it and left it uncovered. He uncovered it and used it. He left it uncovered. Then the second person is chayav, right? Sorry, let me just correct myself. The second person came and found it uncovered. He didn't uncover it himself. He found it uncovered and he was using it, and then he left the scene and he didn't cover it. The second person is chayav. Second person is chayav in this case because he's the one that left it uncovered. The first person did all his duty and he covered it and he did the right thing. And the second person came and found it uncovered and left the scene. So the first person is potter and the second person is chayav. So in such a case where the first person left the bore covered, he left it covered, which is good, which is the correct thing you're supposed to do with the bore. You're supposed to leave it covered. He left the scene with the bore covered, and then the second person came and found that the bore was uncovered. How it got uncovered, Rashi explains, because the covering disintegrated and just was rotted, and it wasn't very good, and so it fell in. And then the second person then left the scene and left it uncovered. So the second person takes responsibility. So the Gemara starts Verishon. Now we'll skip to the Gemara. Verishon ad emas miftar. Until when is the first person going to be potter on this bore? In other words, forever now, if the bore remains uncovered, the second person is always going to be for la'olam vayed responsible for the damages of the bore. Or at some point in time, are we going to say that the first person also has going to have to get involved and deal with covering the bore? So until when is the first person potter? So there's three opinions over here. Omar Rav b'kedei sheyeda. Rav says that the first person is potter until he actually finds out that the bore is uncovered. Once he's found out, Rashi explains over here that once he walks past and he sees that the bore is megule, now both of them know that the bore is uncovered. Both of the parties know the bore is uncovered, so therefore the responsibility is chal on both. It's on both of them. They're both chayav to pay, because now, even though the Rishon originally covered it and he did his job and left the scene and was on the sheni, but once the Rishon finds out, sees, actually comes to the site and see the bore uncovered, then the first person takes responsibility again, and they're both together. That's according to Rav's opinion. Shmuel Omar b'kedei sheyoidiyuhu. Shmuel says it doesn't have to be that he comes and sees the bore himself, the second person. It's enough that he knows about it, exactly. That other people come and tell him, listen, mister, the bore that you dug has become uncovered and the covering has rotted and it needs to be covered again. Then he takes responsibility from then on. If he doesn't go and deal with it, then he's also equally responsible to the second person. So these are the two opinions. Again, the Mishnah says that really the second person who left it Megula is chayev, but we're saying that the first person is exempt, not forever. He's exempt until either, according to Rav, he comes and sees the bore uncovered, and according to Shmuel, if he comes, or even if he doesn't come, if he knows about it, if someone comes and tells him, then the bore has been uncovered, he then takes responsibility again. And the third opinion, Rabbi Yochanan Omar b'kedei sheyoidiyuhu v'yiskor poyalim v'yichroi sarozim v'yichasenu. So here there's a bit of a question of what the correct girsa is, but the girsa that we have is kedei sheyoidiyuhu. That's in like what Shmuel said. He doesn't have to see it himself. It's enough that he's told about it, he knows about it, but he's got a bit more time according to Rabbi Yochanan. In order that not only that he knows about it, but then the time that it takes the yiskor poyalim to hire workers, the yichroi sarozim, and cut down trees, see the wood, trees, the yichasen, uncover the bore. In other words, hakol lefi ha'inyan, that when you find out that your bore has been uncovered, or the cover of your bore is disintegrated, and it doesn't take you 1 second, even if you know about it, it takes time in order for you to arrange to get a proper covering again. Either you have to go to the shops, have to go buy it. You might have to travel to a different city to get them. However long it takes a person to prepare such a covering for the bore, that's how long the first person has got until he takes responsibility again. So what's interesting over here, Rashi explains over here, there's a difference in this last opinion that we just saw that gives him the extra time that takes him to get the poyalim and get the cover. Rashi explains that the second part, there's a difference between the Rishon over here and the Sheni. The Sheni over here, he's the one that actually left the scene with the bore being Meguleh. He is responsible basically straight away. What could he do? So Rashi explains he has to go and get a shomer to come and watch the bore and make sure that nobody falls in. He's more responsible for that. It's incumbent upon him to take a shomer and put it on the bore. Just 1 second. Whereas the first person, he's less responsible over here because he wasn't actually the one that was on the site and left the bore like that. So he's got this extra window of time of how long it takes, even after he's heard about it, how long it will take him to actually physically prepare or get hold of a covering for the bore. So just to summarize what we saw over here, 3 opinions as to when the first person is going to get responsibility again. When is he going to become a chayiv? In such a case where he really covered it, the story from the beginning is that the first person covered the bore and did a proper shmira on the bore. And he left the site, and that shmira, the covering of the bore disintegrated. The second person, he didn't know about it yet, the first person. The second person was on site, saw that it was disintegrated, and he's now the one that has to deal with it. So the Mishnah says that he's chayiv, and the first one's not chayiv. What the Gemara is clarifying is how long is it until the first person will regain the chiyuv. So according to Rav, when he sees it, he regains the chiyuv. Before he's seen it, he doesn't regain the chiyuv, and the chiyuv's on the second person. According to Shmuel, the amount of time until he knows about it, doesn't have to be that he saw it until he knows about it. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, he goes in an extension of Shmuel's shita, that until he knows about it, but not only from when he knows about it, he's got the extra time it will take him in order to prepare getting an actual covering for the bore. Whereas the first person is chayiv straight away, even though he also needs time to collect the covering for the bore, But Rashi says he's more responsible, the second person, because he was on site and he left it like that. So he's responsible to put a shomer on the boar straight away. Yeah. The first one has got the amount of time that it takes, according to Yochanan, to prepare a covering. He's got that long, and the second person straight away has to put a shomer on the boar because he's more responsible in this case. Yeah. So we'll just take any questions if I saw. Baruch is asking a good question on Rav's shita over here. Rav's opinion was that he has to come and see the boar. Why exactly is that? In terms of why isn't it enough that he knows about it? And once he's known about it, he could deal with it with a shliach or something like what you're saying. So that's a good question. I saw that there are some Rishonim or Meforshim that asked that question. We've explained the Gemara here according to Rashi that Rashi learns that he actually has to come and see the boar, or he has to know about the boar. The Gemara doesn't just mean the amount of time it would take for him to hear. It means he actually has to hear about it. But they ask over here on Rashi, why, on Rav's opinion, why is that so? Why isn't it enough that he knows about it? So I don't have a full answer for your question, but I think it's a good question. Why, according to Rav, it seems that Rav argues on Shmuel, and Rav holds he's not going to regain responsibility just by knowing about it. Question is, why not? Maybe you could say he can't maybe rely on people telling him who says they're really telling the truth until he really sees it himself. Then he really has to go and deal with it. But beforehand, I don't know, maybe, kids are playing around there and it's going to come back. Who knows really what was going on site. So maybe Rav holds that until you actually saw it, you're not going to regain responsibility. That could be. So just knowing about it maybe isn't enough according to Rav. But that Nakuda does need a little bit more looking into. Yeah. Okay, so then let's see the hemshich of the Gemara. There were two cases in the Mishnah which I just want to go over because they're going to be very needed for this Gemara. Two cases of the Mishnah which seemingly are quite obvious, and the Gemara is going to explain. We're going to learn from the Gemara what the chiddush in each case. Excuse me. The Mishnah says. Now we get the third line of the Mishnah. Kisol karoi. If a person covered it karoi. Now we're not talking about bor of shupin anymore. We've left that sugya. One guy owns the bor, one guy dug the bor, and he covered it properly. V'nafal asoicha shor or chamor fell in umeis. Potter, he's potter. If a person covers it properly, then he's potter. That's the first din of the Mishnah. The second din of the Mishnah, loik yisol koroi. If he didn't cover it properly, v'nafal asoicha shor or chamor umeis chayev. Then he's chayev. Seems to be two obvious things. If you cover it properly, and then somehow we'll see how something fell in, your potter because you covered it properly. And if you didn't cover it properly and then a shor chamor fell in, then you are chayiv. So now the Gemara says as follows: the two dots, about 4 lines after the Gemara starts. Kisol koroi v'nafal l'soicha shor chamor umeis potter. If you covered it properly, you're potter. Says the Gemara, kevan to kisol koroi heichi nofal. If you covered it properly, how did at the end of the day a shor or a chamor fall into this bor? You covered it properly. How did it fall in? So we spoke about the answer already, but here's the Gemara that actually says it. Amr Yitzchak bar Chana sheisliya mitoichai, that it rotted from within its side, mitoichai, from within, not from the outside, because then perhaps it will be able to be seen, and the owner should see that it's rotting. But it was internally rotten, and therefore it was soft, and it just fell through, and then a shor or chamor fell in. That's an oinus basically. And you weren't supposed to, we don't assume you should have known about such a thing. That's quite an unusual circumstance. So therefore you're potter on it. That's why the Mishnah says if you covered it properly, even if at the end of the day it rotted and fell through, but since you weren't supposed to know about it, then you're going to be potter. Again, let's just clarify. If the person's standing there and he sees it, and the owner sees that the bor is fed, then certainly he's chayav straight away to go and deal with it and get another covering or whatever. But in such a case that the guy's, living in his house and he's got a bor outside, or made the bor in Rishus Harabim, and he covered it. He's not on site all the time. He's allowed to assume that it's not going to be rotten inside. So even if it gets rotten inside, he's potter because he didn't have to expect such a circumstance to take place. Oh. Now the Gemara says this Gemara goes interesting Gemara with a question. It goes on for basically the rest of this Amud and the next Amud. Slightly different, but we'll see. They asked the following question. Kisol kisui sheyochol lamoid lifnei shvarim, ve'ein yochol lamoid lifnei gemalim. Now, a person put a covering on his bor which wasn't the most strong covering you could ever put on. It was a covering which was strong enough to withhold or withstand shvarim. If an ox goes across the covering of the boar would be fine. The covering can withstand the weight of a shor. However, it cannot withhold. It can't stand the weight of a gamal, of a camel. Presumably, a camel weighs more than a shor. So therefore, such a covering, if a shor walks over it, it would fall in. But if a camel walks over it, if a gamal walks over it, the covering would break. And what happened in this case? So the guy did this covering, and what happened? Va'asu Gemalim came va'arua, and they broke the covering of the boar. Then va'asu shvarim v'noflu bei. Then the shvarim fell in. So what's the din in this case? What's the din in this case? In other words, you did a shmira which was good enough for the shvarim to stand there, and you were allowed to assume shvarim. You're not going to take responsibility for a shor which falls in to this boar because, the covering you did was good enough for shvarim, but it wasn't good enough for gemalim, which are heavier. And gemalim came and broke the shmira, and then the shvarim fell in. What's the din in this case? So the Gemara says it depends really. Well, heichi dami, says the Gemara. Either shchichi gemalim. Depends how common camels are. Camels, if they're very common walking around, shchichi means it's very common gemalim. You're in a reshus harabim that there's camels walking, to and fro all day long. Then poisheyahu. Then the person's a poisheya. Poisheya means that he's negligent over here, and even regarding shvarim, he should be considered negligent, because even though the shmira he did could technically withhold shvarim, but since shchichi gemalim are common, then he's a poisheya, and he's certainly going to be chayiv for whatever happens. So the Gemara is asking you, what's your question at all? There's no question, of course. If gemalim are common, then of course you're going to be poisheya, you're going to be chayiv. Then the Gemara says, "Ve'ida loy shchichi gemalim." If gemalim, you're in a place where you don't normally see a camel walking through the reshus harabim all day long. It's not a common thing. It's a very uncommon thing. Then onasu, then you're still on oinus. Why are you going to be chayiv? So the Gemara is saying, what is the case that you're having a suffix about? Iboilahu, we had a question in this case. What's the question? Let's just go and see. If camels are a common place running around, then of course you're going to be chayiv. And if they're not running around, then you're not going to be chayiv. You're going to be honest. So it says the Gemara, loit sricha da asu lefrakim. The case where we're having a question, the suffix of the Gemara is when camels are not very common, but not uncommon. They come occasionally, lefrakim. They come occasionally. Yeah. So what do you say in this case? Mi amrina, and the Gemara speaks out. Do we say kevan da asyan lefrakim, since they come, occasionally, poisheyahu? He's considered therefore a poisheya. How can you leave a covering of a boar in the reshus harabim, let's say, that's going to not withstand camels when occasionally camels come, they come occasionally. That's enough to make you a poisheya. The Gemara says he was required to think that this could have happened. It's not such a rare occurrence that a camel comes. He should have assumed it could come. Oy dilma, or do we say no? Kevan dahashta mihas leika onasu. Since perhaps now they're not here gemalim, and they don't always come. So perhaps you're considered an oinus. That is the question. That's the first question of this Gemara. What's in the following case? Let's just summarize. The case is at the end of the day, when a person has a boar and he covers the boar, but not with such a strong covering that could withstand anything. It can withstand shvarim walking over it. An ox walks over it, it's fine. But if a camel walks over it, it's going to break the case, break the covering. So if a camel falls in, let's just point out, then you are actually chayiv. That Rashi says, and Tosfos also points out, if a camel falls in, you're going to be chayiv because you're poisheya for a camel for sure, because the shmira you made never was good for a camel. But the question is, what happens if the camel ruins the case, and then a shor came and fell in after that? Are you liable in such a case? So there's really three scenarios, right? If camels are always running around, then you're certainly chayiv for a shor that would then fall in after the camel broke it, because they're so common, you have to assume they're going to be here and break the shmira. If they don't come at all, they're really not shchiach to come, then you're also going to be potter, because you're an oinus. You don't have to assume that camels are going to be found over here. It's very uncommon. The question of the Gemara is, what's in a case where camels are occasionally roaming around the Rishus Harabim. Do we say that since they occasionally come, it's not an unexpected occurrence if a camel comes, therefore he's going to take responsibility for the shore that fell in afterwards? Or do we say, no, since now they're not here, you're not chayav to take responsibility? That's the question of the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Toshma, we're going to try and prove it from both cases of the Mishnah that we saw. How do we see this in the Mishnah? Toshma, let's hear a raya from the Mishnah. Kisol koroi. This was the first case of the Mishnah, first baba, if you covered it properly, person covered the boar properly and the shor chamor fell in your potter because you covered it properly. Hey chidami, what's the case of this Mishnah? If you say the Mishnah when it said you covered it koroi means completely koroi for shvarim and koroi for gemalim, a completely fully fledged cover that's going to survive everything, then hey chinofa, then how did the animal actually fall in? Now, we did just say it could fall in because of it was rotten, but the Gemara is assuming, doesn't yet know that at this point. The Gemara is going to say that later. So at this point, we're saying if it's fully covered to cover Shvarim and Gemalim, then how would it fall in at all? What's the case of the Mishnah? Why is it saying that your potter fell in? Elalav, Karoi Shvarim, let's turn over the page, Sunun Beis on the base. Veloy Karoi Gemalim. It must be that you covered it a covering that is Roy for Shvarim and not Roy for Gemalim. Right? In other words, when the Mishnah says you covered it koroi, it means in this case of koroi, a case which was koroi the shvarim, was appropriate for shvarim and not roi for gemalim, because it can't be that it was roi for everything, because the Gemara said how could anything fall in? So obviously it was roi for shvarim and not roi for gemalim. Now the Gemara speaks out further. The either shchichi gemalim, if it's very common that gemalim are going to come, camels are always running around, then amai potter. Why does the Mishnah say that you're potter? You left the boar with a covering that's not good enough for gemalim. Gemalim are very common, so why are you potter? But you shouldn't be potter. You should be chai. So we're trying to establish the case of the Mishnah. The idoloi shchichi gemalim. If gemalim are not very common at all, then pshita. The Mishnah wouldn't have to tell me in that case that if you covered it appropriately for shvarim and not for gemalim that you're potter. If gemalim are never coming, that's obvious. The Mishnah doesn't tell me things that are obvious. Then you're an oinasu. Elalav the asyan lefrakim. It must be. This is exactly the case of our Mishnah. The case of the Mishnah is you covered it roy for shvarim and not for gemalim, and gemalim are occasionally coming. Gemalim are occasionally coming, and what happens? Va'asu gemalim came. Va'aruah they ruined the shmira. They made it worse. Va'asu shvarim va'naflu, and then shvarim fell in. V'katani potter, and on that the Mishnah says you are potter. Alma. So we see from here. Kevan de hashta leka onasu. We want to prove from the Gemara, from this Mishnah, that really in our case you really consider it an oinus. Again, let's just summarize. Where do you see it in the Mishnah? The Mishnah said one line. If a person covers his bor koroi and a shor or chamor fell in, you're potter. That's what the Mishnah says. If you covered it koroi, you're potter. But the Gemara goes through a whole thing to establish what's really the case of the Mishnah. If the Mishnah is speaking about a case you covered it koroi for everything for shvarim and gemalim, then of course, then how did anything fall in at all? So the Gemara assumes it must be that it was koroi for shvarim, it was appropriate for shvarim and not roi for gemalim. And the Gemara carries on and says, still, what's the case? If gemalim are coming all the time, then of course you should be chayav. You're a posheya. And if gemalim are not coming at all, then it's obvious that you're potter. So it must be the cases that they're coming occasionally, and on that the Mishnah says you're potter. So we prove from the Mishnah that in such a case, a person can assume that a camel's not going to come. And if a camel comes, he's considered an oinus. And therefore, he's potter. That's what the Gemara wants to bring a raya from here. Then the Gemara says, Omri loy. La'olam karoi l'shvarim ukaroi l'gemalim. The case of the Mishnah really is where it was roi for shvarim and it was roi for gemalim. It was a fully fledged covering for everything. But the kakasha lach, and you ask the question, how did it fall? If we're assuming that we assume that if it was roi for everything, the Mishnah can't be talking about that case, because how did anything fall in if it was completely fully covered? On that, the Gemara says, on Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Chana, which we saw before, the case of the Mishnah is it was fully covered, bain for gemalim, bain for shvarim, for everything. Just how did it fall in? Because it rotted inside, it internally rotted, and therefore it fell in. So the Mishnah bears no relevance to our suffix at all. Our suffix was in a case where a person leaves it uncovered appropriately for gemalim, but yes, okay for shvarim. What's the case if gemalim occasionally come? So we have no raya from the Mishnah because the Mishnah is dealing with a pure, simple case where a person covered it 100%, which covers all animals, a thick covering. Just a different problem happened that it got rotten inside, and that's how something fell in, and that's why you're potter, because you really were an oinus, because you didn't have to expect that would happen. But in any event, it doesn't shed any light on our suffering. Say that again. Which other Tana? The first part of the let's start the next raya. The Gemara attempts to bring another raya in the opposite way round from the next line of the Mishnah. Toshma. These Gemaras are a little bit confusing, but it's the same theme, so it repeats itself again. So if you've understood it the first time, we'll see it should fly. As you can see, there's a lot of words on this Amud, and there's not so much Rashi because it's a little bit of a repetition, but the stages of the Gemara are quite similar. Toshma. The second thing in the Mishnah said, if you didn't cover it properly, and a shor or chamor fell in there, then you're chayav, right? The Mishnah is doing where it says you didn't cover it karoi, not karoi, and something fell in, then you're chayav. Then says the Gemara, hey chidam. What's the case? What's the case of the Mishnah? When the Mishnah said it was not covered karoi, what does it mean? Does it mean shaloi karoi at all, not for shvarim and not for gemalim? Then the Gemara says pshita, sricha lemeima dechayev. Of course you're chayav if you didn't cover it at all. Yeah, or excuse me, if you did a covering that wasn't roy, not for shvarim and not for gemalim, of course you're chayav. The Mishnah is not going to be telling me that. Elalav karoi leshvarim v'loi karoi legemalim. Elamai, it must be that it is elalav karoi leshvarim v'loi karoi legemalim. It must be that it's really roy for shvarim. It's roy for something. When the Mishnah says loy karoi, it didn't mean loy karoi in legamri. It meant it's roy for shvarim and not roy for gemalim, which is our case, right? It's roy for shvarim, v'loy roy legemalim. Now the Gemara says again, hey chidami, what's the case? What happened? Either shchichi gemalim, if gemalim are very very common to come, then posheyahu. Of course you're going to be chayav. It's obvious because gemalim are always here. Either loy shchichi gemalim, if gemalim are not at all common to come, then you're onasu. So the Mishnah doesn't make sense. The Mishnah says that you were chayiv in the second case. It shouldn't be true. If the gemalim are not shchiach, then you're an onus. Elalav the asyan lefrakim must be dealing with a case that they come occasionally. The gemalim, va'asu gemalim va'aru, who they ruin the shmira, va'asu shvarim v'noflu bei, and then shvarim came in, v'katani chayiv, and it taught that you're chayiv. Alma kevan the asyan lefrakim. We see from here, since they come occasionally, posheyahu. The boy leila suki adaite, because he should have thought that gemalim could come. So let's just summarize what this raya is. The Mishnah said again one short line, and that is a person left his bore, he didn't cover it karoi, and then something fell in your chai. Right? He didn't cover it karoi. And the Gemara wants to establish what is the case that the Mishnah says when it says he didn't cover it karoi. Doesn't mean he didn't cover it karoi, not for gemalim and not for shvarim, then of course you're chai. Of course you're going to be chai, that's pshita. So the Mishnah must mean that you covered it roi for shvarim, but not roi for gemalim. So when the Mishnah says you covered it shaloi karoi, it was referring to shaloi karoi for gemalim. And on that the Mishnah says you're chayiv. But still the Gemara says, what's the case of the gemalim? If they're coming all the time, of course you're chayiv, it's pshita. If they're coming very, very not occasionally at all, then the Mishnah couldn't be dealing with that case, because in that case you're going to be potter. Must be they're coming occasionally, and we see that when they come occasionally, you're still going to be chayiv for the shore that fell there. So we say that a person should assume that a camel will come, even though they only are coming occasionally. So this was a riot to say that you're going to be chayiv in such a case. So on that, the Gemara says, no. La'olam, if you the beginning of the line where there's a little aleph of the bach, la'olam, we're going to be matche the raya. We're going to refute the raya. There's no raya from here anymore. La'olam karoi l'shvarim v'loi karoi l'gemal. Really, we're dealing with it where it was roi for shvarim and not roi for gemalim. V'shchichi gemalim, and gemalim are very very common. They're very common. So we asked on that. That's going to be obvious. But the kakasha lach posheyahu. Of course, you're going to be chayiv in that case. It's obvious. Says the Gemara, "Id the nasif reisha kiso karoi, nasif seifa nami loy kiso karoi." In other words, there really is no chiddush in this part of the Mishnah. It's just taught to be the symmetrical parallel case of the first line of the Mishnah. The first line of the Mishnah said, if you covered it properly and then something fell in, you're going to be potter. So the Mishnah stylistically said the parallel case to say, and if you don't cover it karoi, then you're going to be chai. But there's no actual chiddush. We don't have to find a chiddush in the second case because it's just taught stylistically to parallel the first case. But really, the main klal of the Mishnah is the first case, which we already established. There's no rive in the first case because the first case could be dealing in a case where he covered it karoi for everything, and there was his sliya mitoichoi. He got rotten inside, and then something fell in, and in that case you're potter because you're an idol. That is the first chelik of this Gemara. So actually, at this point in the Gemara, we didn't have an answer to our question. We tried to bring a raya one way from the first line of the Mishnah and the opposite way from the second line of the Mishnah. But for our question, which again, to summarize, the question is: a guy leaves the boar covered appropriately and maspik chazak for a shore to walk over, but for a camel which weighs more, it won't be strong enough for. So what happened? The camels came. And if the camels are coming all the ways in a shchiach, then of course you're going to be chayiv when the camels come and ruin the shmira and the shore falls in. If the camels are never coming, then and pitom one time a camel came and ruined it, then you're certainly going to be potter because you're an oinus. The question is what happens when camels periodically come, occasionally come. It's not shchiach and it's not shchiach. It's somewhere in the middle. Do we assume a person should take responsibility and think, you know what, camels sometimes come here, so I better do better shmira? Or do we say no? You can assume that camels are not going to come, and not. At the end of the day, at this point, we do not have a raya from the Mishnah in either way around. Good. Any questions?
So
we're left with a suffix at this point.
It's not taken.
The Gemara doesn't say teku because the Gemara is going to go to say another lashon. You have sometimes a lishna kama and a lishna basra. Here we're going to say ikeda amri. There are those that say over this the Gemara in a different way. We'll see now. Ikeda Amri is also about 12 lines down from the top. That's an estimate. Ikeda Amri means that there are those that report over. This was actually the question that they had in the base of Medrash. A different question. Hanami vade lo yiboila. This is not a question we had at all. The kevan de asyan lefrakim, since they come occasionally gemalim, then pusheya hu the iboile asuki adaite. This lashon assumes that, come on, let's be honest, camels occasionally come. You can't play innocent and say, oh, no, I thought it was going to be like lightning strap, or, the dog ate my homework. No, it's not such a non-common thing. Camels occasionally come. That's enough to give you responsibility. And if you look, it looks like the Aleph, Jeff, right, as you asked, what's the din? Seems like we paskin at this point that, of course, in the case we had, that they occasionally come, it's certainly going to be chayav. Certainly going to be chayav. You should assume that they could come and you're chayav. Ki yiboy elan. What is the question that we had? What's the question that we had? Hachi hu de yiboy elan. This was the following question. This is a similar case but different. Kisui sheyochel lamod b'fnei shvar. The guy covered the boar with a covering, again the same structure that could withstand shvar. The eina yochel lamod b'fnei gemalim. They're much heavier. It cannot withstand camels. The shchichi gemalim. Camels are very, very common to come. So at this point in time, of course, you should be chayav. Camels are common to come. In the end of the day, the camels didn't break the shmira. What broke the shmira was that it got rotten. What broke the covering was that the covering got rotten inside. So in one aspect, you were a big posheya because you left a covering in a board which doesn't withstand camels. And camels are running around all day long, shchichi. But at the end of the day, this specific case, the camels didn't break the boar. The boar was broken by the unexpected rottenness of the cover. Mao. What do we say in this case? Mi amrinan migu the heavy poisheya etzel gemalim, heavy poisheya nami le'inyan hasla. Oidim maloi amrinan migu. Here the Gemara's got a very interesting question. Actually, we said all along, if the covering gets rotten inside, that's called an oinus. An unexpected thing that you are not really usually supposed to take responsibility for. If an oinus happens, but derech klal, oinus is a patur in a lot of things, and in the zikin is one of them. If a wild oinus happens, and a ruach, if you watch your shore and with a big fence, and a ruach she'ena mitzuya, a hurricane comes and take, which is so uncommon in Ramat Bet Shemesh, it'd be a hurricane to blow away your big stone wall. That's called an oinus in your potter. So too, if it gets rotten, really is an oinus and you should be potter. That's what we said all along. But here the Gemara has got an interesting topic to say as follows. Since the person was Pisheya in this covering, it wasn't a good covering for camels, because camels are very common and it wasn't strong enough for camels. Perhaps we should say what the Gemara calls migu. Since you were Pisheya for Gemalim, you're going to be considered Pisheya for the Haslah as well. The Haslah meaning the rottenness as well. In other words, you can't say that, oh, I'm such an oinus over here because it rotted inside, because you really should have been more careful with this thing for Gemalim. And it was very likely the camels were gonna ruin this thing. So perhaps that should give you a din poisheya. It should give you a halacha that you're considered responsible, even if a very uncommon event happened in the end, because you put yourself into a position where you were poisheya for Gemalim, which is very common. So do we say this yisoid of migu or not? Do we say that mi amrin and migu the heavy poisheya etzel Gemalim heavy poisheya nami le'inyan hasla, or dil maloi amrin and migu? That's the question. The question is clear? Should we repeat the question? The question of the Gemara is in the following scenario. The guy left a bad shmira on his board. It's a bad shmira. Why is it bad? Because it will not withstand camels, and we're living in a place where camels are running around all day long. This specific question of the Gemara, camels are running around all day long. But what happened in the end? If a camel would have ruined the shmira and then shore falls in, of course you're going to be chayav, because you left a board which camels can ruin the shmira and things can fall, then you're certainly going to be chayav. But the Gemara is speaking about a case where that didn't happen. The guy was lucky, Baruch Hashem, camels didn't go near his board. They did not ruin the shmira. But what happened? It rotted. It rotted. The covering of the board rotted. Now, normally rotting is a thing you do not take responsibility for, because it's very uncommon. It's very uncommon. You can't see it. You don't know when it's going to be. It's uncommon. You don't normally take responsibility for a rotten cover. You're an oinus. But in this case, the Gemara is giving an argument. Perhaps you should be responsible even though it rotted. Why? Because you left it in such a bad situation that camels could ruin it. And camels are very, very common. So you were poisheya legabe gemalim. That means to say you were negligent with respect to camels. The question of the Gemara is, does that negligence that you made in this covering of the board with respect to camels make you consider that you're negligent for the rotting as well? That is the question. Or do we say, no, you were negligent about camels. The Baruch Hashem, camels didn't come. So what did happen? It got rotten on them. That you didn't have to expect that. So that's the argument that, no, maybe you're really going to be potter because it was an unexpected event. What happened at the end of the day? It rotted. So that's an unexpected event. So maybe you should be potter because it's an unexpected or innocent event. But the other argument is you can't really call this guy so innocent because he left his boar with a covering that Gemalim could easily come, and their common Gemalim, come and ruin it. So therefore, that's the question of the Gemara. Do we say that the negligence with regard to camels makes you negligent with regarding to the rotting that took place? That clearer? I think so.
But shouldn't this same thing with apply to the first person? Because he should also check the covering. Why leave it to the second person only?
Here we're talking about there's only one person. Here we're talking about there's only one person who's covering the board. And the question is that did he left the covering in a very bad way because camels could ruin the covering. But at the end, the covering got ruined through being rotten. So we say that he's negligent on the rotting as well. That's the question of the Gemara. So the Gemara does a similar structure. Can we bring a raya from our Mishnah? So the Gemara says as follows. So the bottom line is, do we say migu or not? Migu meaning since you were negligent for camels, you are negligent for the rotting or not. Toshma. So the Gemara wants to bring a raya. Toshma. Kiso koroi. The guy covered his boar koroi. This is the first line of the Mishnah. You covered it appropriately, and the shor or chamor fell in umeis potter, and you died. And it died. You are potter. Excuse me. You are potter on this book because you covered it appropriately. Ve'it marala, and it was said upon our Mishnah, which we know already. The ratio of the Mishnah was dealing with a case. We covered it appropriately, but it got rotten. Now the Gemara is saying, hey chidam. What's the case? What's really going on behind this case where it got rotten? If we're dealing with the case where you covered it completely good for shvarim and for gemalim and it still got ruined, pshita the potter might have a little mevad. Obviously, your potter. What should you have done? You're an oinus. It got ruined from the inside. You're certainly going to be potter. Elalav karoy l'shvarim. It must be the Mishnah is dealing with a case where it was roy l'shvarim, v'loy karoy l'gemalim. Back to our case where it was good enough, strong enough for shvarim, not strong enough for gemalim, v'shchichi gemalim, and then the gemalim fell in. Excuse me, shchichi gemalim. Gemalim are very common. V'sliya metoichai, but then at the end of the day, it got rotten. The gemalim didn't ruin it. It got rotten through the rot, not through the gemalim. And on that, the Mishnah says, "Your potter, v'katani potter." Alma loy amrinan migu devi b'sheya le'inyan gemalim, devi b'sheya le'inyan hasla. So we want to prove a ride from here that we don't say migu, because the ratio of the Mishnah says kisol karoi, if you covered it properly, and then something fell in your potter, and the Gemara wants to say we know the case is, how did it fall in if it was covered karoi, fell into his matoichai. But the Gemara still wants to say, if it was covered karoi, mamish for shvarim and for gemalim, then it's obvious that you're going to be potter if it's matoichai. Obvious. So it must be that it was roy for gemalim and not roy for shvarim, and yet, excuse me, roy for shvarim and not roy for gemalim and shchichi gemalim, and it still says that you are potter because it was isliya metoichai. So we see you don't say migu. We don't say you were negligent regarding camels, so therefore you're negligent regarding the rotting. We don't say that. That's what the Gemara wants to bring a raya, and then the Gemara says no, there's no raya. Loy lo'ilam karoi legemalim u karoi l'shvarim. Really, it's roy for everything. It's roy for gemalim and it's roy for shvarim. And it still got rotted inside. You asked a question, that's obvious. If a guy covers his bore completely, 100% stable for any animal that could come, and then it gets rotten inside, we said that's obvious. What could he have done? Of course he's going to be potter. Says the Gemara, no, he could have done something. He could have gone and knocked on the cover of the bore. If he would go periodically and check whether or not there's internal rotting inside this covering, then there is something a person can do to check that. So that's the chiddush of the Mishnah. Just 1 second. That's the chiddush of the Mishnah, that even though he covered it appropriately, so there really is no raya for our case, because we're not dealing with a case where it was not raya for gemalim. It was raya for everything. And still the Mishnah is telling me he's potter when it got rotted inside. The Gemara said that's obvious. The Gemara says it's not obvious because we could have thought, we might have said, he is responsible actually to go and check whether or not this covering is rotting or not. Komash Malan, that we don't say he's supposed to check, because really it is very uncommon that it gets rotten, but you still see there's some chiddush of the Mishnah. The chiddush of the Mishnah is a person does not have to periodically check that there's no internal rotting of the covering, because that is actually an uncommon thing. Yeah. Laura. Let's go weiter. The Gemara is going to prove now again from the second half of the Mishnah to this question. Toshma, the second line of the Mishnah said, if you don't cover the roar appropriately and the shor or chamor fall in, then you're taking responsibility, you're chayiv. Hey chidam, what's the case? If it wasn't roy for any animal, not for shvam and not for gemalim, then stricha lemeima the chayiv. The Mishnah needed to tell me that you chayiv. Of course you chayiv. It's obviously chayiv if you didn't do it at all roy, not for shvam and not for gemalim. Elalav karoi l'shvarim v'loi karoi l'gemalim. Must be that when the Mishnah says it was shaloi karoi, it means actually roy for shvarim and not roy for gemalim, right? So it wasn't strong enough for camels. Now the Gemara goes again and says either shchichi gemalim, if gemalim are running around over a common posheya, he's going to be posheya. It's obvious he's going to be chayiv. But either lo shchichi gemalim, honest, he's going to be an oinus, and therefore he's going to be potter. How can the Mishnah say he's chayiv? Ela lav the shchichi gemalim. Really, we're dealing with where the shchichi gemalim. Gemalim are very, very common. And in the end of the day, the gemalim didn't ruin the bore, covering of the bore, it got rotten. But Katani chayiv, and the Mishnah teaches that you are chayiv. Alma amrin and migu devi b'sheila in gemalim, and b'sheila in hasla. The Gemara wants to bring a right that we do say migu. We do say, since you are negligent with regard to camels, you're going to be negligent in regard to that to the rotting, because otherwise, what's the case of the Mishnah? The Mishnah says you didn't cover it appropriately, you're chayiv. The Gemara deduced with all what we just read that the Mishnah must be dealing with a case where it was roy l'shvarim and not for gemalim, and the shchichi, and it was rotten, and then you see that you're chayiv. The Gemara says, Amri loy la'olam karoi l'shvarim v'loy karoi l'gemalim. Really, it was roi for shvarim and not roi for gemalim. B'shchichi gemalim, v'aslu gemalim v'arua, v'aslu shvarim v'naflu bei. We're not dealing with the case where it got rotten at all. We're dealing with the case where the camels came and they ruined it. You asked with the kakashalach pshita. You said that's obvious. If the camels actually ruin it and the shchichi, then it's obvious. Posheyahu said the Gemara, I did the nasiv reisha kisol karoi, nasiv seifa nami loy kisol. Also, like we said above, it's just parallelizing the reisha. There's no specific chiddush in the seifa. It's just coming to say that the parallel symmetrical case where the reisha says the person covered it appropriately. The seifa is dealing with a case where he didn't cover it appropriately, even though there's no chiddush in the actual seifa. Let's just see one more raya to get us to the bottom of the Amud, and then we'll see. Toshma. Nofal, also a raya, funnily enough, from our Mishnah. Nofal asoichoy shor cheirish shoyte v'koton suma umahalich b'layla chayav. If an animal fell into the bore, which is a shor cheirish, a blind shor, shoyte is an insane, crazy shor.
Shor cheirish is blind.
Oh, shor cheirish. That Suma says later in the Brisa. Cheirish would normally mean deaf over here, right? But the question is, that's a good question. Why would you be these? Let's just see for once. I'll come back to that question in a minute. I'll come back to the question in a second. Shoite, v'koton, shor koton, a suma, a blind shor, umahalich balayla, or shor that's going in the night, chayiv. In all these cases, you're chayiv for the shor fell in. Whereas, as we're going to see in a second, pikeach umahalich bayoim, if the shor was a pikeach and it was going during the day, then you're potter. This is a halacha which we said briefly yesterday, that if a healthy shor falls into your board during the day, you're actually potter on it, because we say that shor should have looked where he was going, and he himself, fancied like jumping into the board. But it's not your responsibility. He should have watched where he was going. That shor. So that's why you're potter on it. The only shor you're chayav on is either if the shor is blind, or if the shor is a shoiter and he doesn't even know where it's going, and the shor is a koton, or it's at night time. In all those cases, then you're chayav, because then you can't say the shor himself fell in. So your question, Baruch, is a good question about cheirish. I'm not sure why he falls into the category of seemingly he's deaf, right? But he can see where he's going, the cheirish. So why don't we say that you should be potter, that because he should have watched where he was going? I'm not sure about that. We'll try and find an answer for that question. But in any event, the Mishnah says you're chayiv on a shor which is blind or during the night, but a shor pikeach you are potter. Now the Gemara says, "Va'amai, why are you potter on a shor who goes during the day?" We should say, "Neima midahevi poisheya le'inyan cheirish, hevi nami poisheya le'inyan pikeach." We should say this principle of, since you were negligent with regards to another kind of shor, you were negligent regard your bore in Rosh Hashanah or wherever it is you were negligent with regard to animals falling in which are blind or which are a shoiter or during the night. You're negligent on all these kinds of shvarim. So that if we say you're negligent on one thing, it means you're negligent on the other thing. We should say even with a shor which is a pikeach, which is a perfectly good shor, which is going during the day, you're also negligent on him because of this principle of migu. Since you're negligent on X, Y, Z, we're going to say you're negligent on A, B, C as well. And we don't say that. We actually say you're potter on the shore that goes during the day. The shore that goes during the day. So you see from here that Shema Mino loy amrin on migu, Shema Mino. We're bringing a raya from here that you do not say migu, and this is actually a proof. At the end of the day, this is a proof that Gemara sticks with to the question of whether or not we say you're negligent on one thing, you're negligent on another thing. We don't say that. What you're negligent on, and you have to pay. What you weren't negligent on, you were not negligent on. We don't say since you were, so in our case, we don't say since you were negligent on camels that were running around, that will make you negligent on the rotting. We don't say that. Really, you'll be potter if it rots. And in this case of the Mishnah, we don't say since you're negligent on the blind shore, so you're going to be negligent on a shore that can see as well. We do not say that, and therefore you're going to be potter on whatever you are not negligent on. Okay, thanks very much. That was a bit of a technical Gemara today. Hope we all pulled through, and Bezos Hashem will carry on tomorrow. Yeah.